Hi, you're listening to Scribble Talk Teaching, a podcast for bid and proposal professionals. My name is Bhaskar Sundaram, and I'll be sitting down with the industry leaders to share topics that are critical to your success, both for your career and also for your business. Today, we have Richard Goring, our favorite guest, is back. Richard, as you know, is a director at BrightCarbon, a specialist presentation and e-learning agency. He has helped to write and create thousands of presentations and coached hundreds of teams to present more effectively using visuals, diagrams, and animated sequences that explain and reinforce the key points. Obviously, you would have guessed what we're going to talk about. Yes, we are going to talk about visual storytelling for successful pitches. Before that, welcome Richard again to Scribble Talk.
Thank you so much, Pascal. Great to be here. Love it.
Richard, what is visual storytelling and why is it important for making a successful pitch?
Well, the idea of visual storytelling is that it does that. It tells stories using visuals. And it's a brilliant medium if you are pitching, because often you have yourself or your presenting team to talk about something, and you'll almost always have a screen of some kind. Now, historically, traditionally, people have always subjected the audience to what's been termed death by PowerPoint because that screen has been filled with lots of text.
Correct.
And the problem with lots of text on a slide is not the text itself. You know, books are a fabulous resource and people read them all the time. They're full of text. The problem is text and someone speaking about it at the same time. So the way that people process information is the words you read and the words you hear are all processed in a single part of the brain, something called the phonological loop. And so it's virtually impossible for people to read and listen at the same time. People get overwhelmed, they can't focus on stuff properly. And so it's one of the reasons you get that death by PowerPoint with these kind of walls of text being presented. So if you are going to speak, as you almost always are in an oral presentation or oral pitch, you're going to use these visuals or this kind of screen to provide you with media. Visuals are a great way to do it because it means that it's not going to interfere with people's ability to listen to you speak. And in fact, and the reason is that because visuals are processed in a different part of the brain, something called the visuospatial sketchpad. And what's really wonderful about the idea of using visuals as well as audio narrative from the presenter is that the two things combine. There's another part of the brain called the episodic buffer, and it links it all together. So you're getting a true multimedia experience with kind of dual coding of these two streams of information. And so it becomes a very compelling and very memorable way of conveying information. And then you look at things like, you know, YouTube, Netflix, television. These things are incredibly popular ways to be able to sit there and be entertained and absorb a huge amount of information because you've got this kind of multimedia stream. And so that's really what you're tapping into. You're telling your stories in a way that makes them compelling and engaging so that ultimately people will be convinced and people will remember what it is you've had to say over everyone else that's going to be pitching to them as well.
That's brilliant, Richard. Again, you know what? We all know visual storytelling is important, but why do you think people then end up doing the same things that they shouldn't do?
There are probably two reasons. One is that if you open up PowerPoint, and PowerPoint is generally the tool of choice, but it doesn't matter. It can be Google Slides or Keynote or Prezi or any of these kinds of tools. It will almost always give you a box that says, click here to add text. And so you do as you're told. And then secondly is that people always do what they've always done. And it can be hard to come up with a true visual. It can be hard to think about what is the best visual representation of something. Or in a world where you're used to sending your slides on afterwards, it can be hard to say, you know what, I'm not going to have any words on this. I'm not going to present a document. I'm going to do something different. And so I think, yeah, following instructions and past behavior of yourself and others are reasons why we probably don't do it. But if you change your mindset and think, you know what, I'm going to do that, it's not only changing the slide, it's changing the way that you approach potentially the whole pitch itself from the RFP. You can't just pick up large chunks of the RFP and put it into the pitch anymore. You can't just send the PowerPoint to people afterwards. You probably need to come up with something separate. You need to make sure that everyone else on your bid team is comfortable with the idea of not having all of the content on all of the slides. And so there are lots of barriers that are possible to overcome, but they're barriers nevertheless, which means that despite everyone knowing that visuals are a great idea, they don't always do them.
Well said, Richard. Again, you know what, I've been doing the same, as you rightly said. You just get to it. But sometimes it's last minute. You just need to pull a slide deck just to confirm certain things that's already written in a document, or sometimes it's in a spreadsheet. You just need to convert it. So it's just as you rightly said, that visual storytelling get lost in the way of sharing the information. But well said there. So,
but that's the point, isn't it? It's like a lot of pitches are exactly that. You spend so much time preparing the proposal in the RFP process. It's like, oh, we can breathe. Oh, we've got to do the pitch. Right, let's cobble stuff together. And that's a shame, because the pitch is often the thing that reflects your proposal a lot. It's probably going to get it's probably the highest visibility piece of the process. Most people involved from the client side are going to see it. And so it feels like such a shame and potentially a wasted opportunity to do that, but it is the nature of it. But we'll talk today, hopefully, about ways that you can avoid that and some of the simple wins to achieve it.
Totally, Richard. So again, we just talked about why visual storytelling is important. We also talked about why it's hard for us to do it. And now let's get into how do you actually create a persuasive story, Richard? Give us some high-level principles or some pointers, please.
So the key thing to think about with visual storytelling is actually the story. I think if you can consider what the story is, you are in a far better position, even if you don't produce slides, quite honestly, and it can be a true oral presentation without any of the visual aids that you might have. Thinking about your story and the way that you're going to share it over the course of, I don't know, 15, 20, 30, 60 minutes or so is a critical part of the process. Don't just open up PowerPoint and start throwing pictures on a slide, because it's not going to work. And so in that instance, you need to think through what is the structure for the story you need to tell. Identify all those kind of key questions at the start. Who is the audience? What are the objectives for this meeting? What are their objectives? What are their challenges and pain points? What are the things that you're trying to solve for? What's the competitive advantage that you have? What are the benefits that you're going to be able to deliver to your audience? And how do you prove your ability to deliver those benefits? Thinking through some of those key concepts is going to be a critical part of this process, and something you should probably do near the start. Not only of the proposal, of the pitch, but also probably the proposal as well, to be honest, because they're all things that should flow through. Ultimately, people are not going to remember a vast amount of the content from all of this. What you need to make sure they remember is why they should choose you over anyone else, and have confidence that you'll be able to deliver it. And so usually most of the story structures out there, you can read things like the Challenger sale, for example, and all the others like it, that say, start off with some kind of problem, whether to set the scene, to set some context, to help people to understand that you know their position. Also to create a sense of urgency as well, that you should be changing, you should be doing it now. The amount of detail you go into on that challenge and problem can vary depending upon whether people have decided they want to change already, and so now they're choosing a version of it, or whether they need to be convinced to change their behavior. You probably also want to put in some kind of example, some kind of insight to be able to show people their current situation in a new light, in the way that they've perhaps not seen things before. So again, you're demonstrating your expertise and credibility there. And then you might come into not necessarily your solution, but the shape of the solution, given all the challenges that you're facing and what's going on, both internally and maybe in the marketplace as a whole, kind of externally. This is the kind of thing that you should probably be doing to solve for that. And of course, that shape of the solution is just a reflection of what you're going to offer. But it's just a nice, quick way of saying, this is where you are. This is what you should get to. Do you agree that that's the kind of thing that would work? Yeah. And if you can do that, this is why you should care. This is the value that you'll get, the benefits that you'll get as a result of doing all of that. And this is all really quick. This is the introduction. This is the first couple of minutes, probably. And then you can get into, right, now let's look at what makes us the best partner to be able to deliver that thing you've identified. And the nice way of kicking a story off like that is that you relatively quickly and easily identify what people need. You get them to agree that this is what they need. And you can now frame all of your solution in that context. You can say, well, we agreed that this is what you need. Great. This is what we deliver and how we can deliver it for you so that you can achieve the benefits that we've talked about. It's also great because you framed the conversation. So you can help to frame it in a way that your competitors can't solve for that either. And so it's a very elegant way to be able to set up a story, especially in a competitive bid situation, which I suspect most of you are in. And that's, as I said, a couple of minutes for your presentation. The rest of it is then going to be proving your ability to deliver. It's showing your solution in detail. It's showing how that helps them to achieve various bits and pieces, the things that you've promised them. And that's where you can then start to use more in the way of visuals to help people to understand how things work, what they do, how they're going to fit into their systems and processes, making sure that you're eliminating risks and all of those other things that are really important. So the story and the structure is really important. And then you will start to get into some of the visual representations of it. So that's kind of high level, which is great. But what about individual slides? What happens when you're showing your implementation plan, your system architecture, your data analysis of what will happen, your projections into the future? Well, at that point, breaking it down into a little story arc itself is probably quite useful. So thinking about how you'll frame it, showing the detail and showing the impact. So if you can think about a structure of a problem, solution, and impact, that works quite nicely for an individual slide or maybe a short sequence of slides so that you've got mini stories within your greater story arc. So it's all nested. And then the actual visuals that come over the top of that, you'll think through, well, I've maybe written this down as bullet points, as speaker notes or a script, if you like. How would you then build that out into more visual sequences instead? And at that point, it's about identifying what is it that's going to be most helpful to your audience to understand what's happening here. Do you need something to represent each of the different points in that story arc, the problem, the solution, the impacts? Probably that would be a good idea. From the notes that you've written, are there key things in there that you need to be able to identify? Perhaps you highlight those and you say, right, we've got this data set and this data set and this data set. Maybe this shows the current situation, maybe this shows what we're going to do, and maybe this shows the impact at the end. Is there a visual that you can use for each of those data sets? Can it be the same visual that you can then manipulate and change to be able to show things? So an obvious one is if you've got 3 numbers, should you chart it, for example, so you can show a trend over time, or can show a comparison between different data sets. If you're going to be talking about an implementation process, is it worthwhile showing that as an actual flow diagram or as a Gantt chart if time is going to be the more important impact of the implementation? Do you show a process where you then highlight who's going to be involved at each of the stages and where it needs to be, or geographically located, and you do color coding or something over a map? So there's a variety of different ways that you might visually represent it. But the key with visual storytelling, perhaps counterintuitively, is not necessarily the visuals, it's the story you're telling underneath them.
Wow, I think you nicely framed the structure of how a pitch should look like, and also introduced how visuals can play a part to that structure, Richard. Again,
Sorry, that was a really long answer. It felt useful to do it.
I know, because, and that's that 5 minutes that you kind of lay down the framework, the structure, and how we can introduce visuals is by far the crux of this talk. So that's super important. If anyone go and re-listen that particular element, that's brilliant. So now we have a structure, and now we also know how visuals can play a part on this, Richard. And what are some of the techniques that you could use to achieve this?
So in terms of building things out, I think we've just talked about, I just mentioned the idea of visualizing your story and thinking about how you might break it down into individual components and coming up with visual representations of it. And at that point, as I said, there's lots of different things that you might need to do. A good way to potentially think about it in more granular terms and more general terms is identify all the bits of information in your story that are key. So what are the main points that you need to get across? Everything else is probably unnecessary, or it's prose around the outside of it, but what are the key elements that are going to go into it? And once you've identified those key elements, you might want to start jumping into visual straight away. But sometimes you need to take a step back and say, right, I've maybe got the curse of knowledge here because you understand what's going on. Is there any extra information that people might need to help contextualize and understand the content you're getting across? Maybe that's a larger set of data, for example, showing previous trends, historical trends. Maybe if you're showing a site map, for example, or a particular location of a building, or kind of the map of the building, maybe you need a site map that's kind of further out to be able to show where this fits in kind of the larger structure. Or if you're going to be showing like global rollouts of something, do you need to show your organization's office locations, but also the client's organization's office locations, so that you can see where they all map up? Extra bits of information that help to contextualize what you are showing, or to be able to show a contrast with the end result that you're going to be getting them towards, so that they'll achieve real benefit and kind of lasting value. So identify the key bits of information that are needed, and identify supplementary information pieces that might be useful as well to help contextualize things. And then at that point, it's identifying what might be a good visual representation for those pieces. The simplest form might be, for example, a series of icons that are then related to each of the points. And you have a slide, which is very simple, with half a dozen icons and half a dozen text points to it. Essentially, though, that's glorified bullet points. So it looks nicer, but it's not necessarily helping people to understand what's going on. So instead, once you've got these visual representations for all of the different components, can you think about ways that they relate to each other? Are you showing comparisons? Are you showing trends? Are you showing flows? Are you showing things happening or progressing over time? Is there a way that you can link them together in some form of diagram to be able to better represent things? Perhaps even better, more elegantly, is there a single image or a single diagram or a single visual that might represent the entire concept? And you can then modify and change that over time to be able to reflect what the story is. And so one of the really useful techniques that you'll have in PowerPoint especially, but also Keynote and Google Slides, is the ability to animate content. One of the problems with lots of text is not only that it's hard to read and listen at the same time, but also it generally all comes up at once. Whereas if you can pace the flow of information so that it's in small bite-sized chunks, then people have the ability to take on board that content in pieces in small amounts, so that they're not overwhelmed, they're not overloaded by the information that's been presented to them. So if you can use simple entrance animation, simple builds in PowerPoint or any of these other tools, you can pace the flow of information so that it's not overwhelming. You can make sure that it synchronizes up with your narrative so that it's encouraging that kind of multimedia experience. And also, you are now making sure, by building things up piece by piece, that everyone in the audience is looking at the same thing at the same time, because they're almost always going to look at the thing that's newly arrived on the slide. And so that means that you've got a great technique to be able to control which portions of the slide, which portions of the visual people are looking at in any one go. And so by building things up like that, it can work really nicely. Now, I'm, of course, very aware that this is an audio media with the joys of podcasting, and we're talking about visual stuff. So slight shameless plug, I'm sorry, but if you go to the BrightCarbon website, brightcarbon.com, we've got loads of examples there of how to do this, loads of articles that will guide you through it with real examples, with real images and stuff. And pretty much every Thursday, we run completely free webinar masterclasses on this kind of stuff too. So if you struggle with this, it might be worth checking one of those out just to see how you might do it with real examples and then apply it to your material as well.
That's brilliant, Richard. I mean, yes, BrightCarbon is an absolutely important source. Again, that Friday webinars, it's free, as Richard said, and it's very, very useful. Sometimes you need to hear that at least 3 times or 30 times to actually make a decision to build a presentation or a pitch in the way that we want. Otherwise, you continue to do what you're doing, but please do utilize BrightCarbon. Go through their website, go through their any templates, resources, and there's a lot of talks Richard does himself, few talks within us, within Scribble, a lot more outside. Please do utilize that as well. 100% Richard, totally. We'll plug that in.
I mean, actually, do you want? Yeah, that's go through to the back catalogue, and you'll see it there as part of the membership tier. So I forget exactly what it was, but again, the webinar that we did together, Bhaskar, was, I think, a good demonstration for any folks listening. You should. I know it's a podcast and you should be, walking around and stuff, but maybe check that out if you can.
Totally. I think we talk about visualization, and this is a great opportunity for people to visualize as we talk, Richard. So that's brilliant. So again, you kind of added layer by layer. So again, that's very, very interesting. Thank you, Richard. Richard, before we close the podcast, again, we talked about structure, we talked about how visuals helps it, we talked about how we can compartmentalize the pitch. Is there anything else, Richard, that you would like to share?
I think the idea with visuals is, as I referenced at the start, you may come across some barriers and some challenges which can be problematic, especially in the bid world where we all are, because there are lots of people involved in a bid team. And so it's not just you. If it's just you, it's much easier. You can cope with it. You've got to be able to cater to other people. And so I think taking them on a journey with you is ideal if you can do. Trying to make sure that you're focusing on the stuff that's really critically important, like the story, and then breaking your content down into bite-sized pieces to help your audience, are all things that are hard to challenge, and generally people will be very accepting if you explain to them why this is the case. But sometimes you need to make compromises. You can't go kind of all out visual. If you look at some of the BrightCarbon presentations that we make, for example, they can be incredibly visual with no text at all. Maybe that's not practical or feasible, both in terms of time to create, but also in terms of the other use cases you've got. So there are a variety of approaches that you can take out there to start thinking about how you make steps towards what you would like to do with kind of true visual storytelling. And so that could be that you're starting to use a hierarchy structure. Maybe you've got high-level visuals, but you've got an annotated diagram or an annotated labeled visual on the slide, which still has a chunk of text, but it's now built into a diagram rather than just being walls of text. So think infographics, for example. They are excellent media where you've got a very visual form that will still work on its own because it's generally got a lot of text, but that text is built into the diagram. And that works really nicely for those situations where you have to give people a copy of your slides afterwards. Because if all of your slides are like infographics, well, they work on their own, but you can also present over the top of them. You still have this small issue, though, of being able to present whilst there's a lot of text on the slide. So there are a couple of different techniques that you can use in PowerPoint, but perhaps the simplest one is to use animation, like I talked about before, not only to pace the flow of information, so using simple builds, but there's also a neat trick where you can have text-based detail on a diagram and you use an exit animation in PowerPoint or Google Slides to get rid of it so it's no longer there. And if you use a disappear animation, then it's just instantly disappeared and people don't ever actually see it. So then you avoid those cringeworthy moments in many presentations where people say, you can't read this, but, and then just move on. They never see it in the first place. And so you can just focus on the visual while you are presenting. But because it's still there on the slide, it's just hidden from view when you're presenting. That means that when you share the slide as a PDF or something later, they can still see it. And that text, which might be very small and so terrible for a presentation, still works fine in a document because they'll be able to read it, they'll be able to get up close, they'll be able to do all the stuff they would normally do. So trying to find these compromises to work with your bid teams to make sure that they are comfortable focusing on the things that really matter to your audience and the visuals that are going to help them to understand what's going on, to stand out, to focus on benefits and competitive differentiation, and to pace the flow of information with builds. All of those things are generally very easy to get to people as long as you help them to understand why you're doing it and what your motivation for it is, and the fact that it really won't impact anything else negatively. And then from there, you build up and you can take it further and further, and you can have a fabulous time creating these really dynamic visual stories that are, as I said at the start, compelling, engaging, and memorable.
What a great closure there, Richard. Again, yes, this is a challenge. We are talking presentation and visuals in an audio format, but that's what makes it interesting, because as you visualize how you could present it, then you are not constrained in what PowerPoint can do, but you can also think it in like what's the right way of presenting. Again, Richard, this was absolutely amazing, as you always do. Visual storytelling for successful pitches. Again, it's a short but very useful podcast. I think 30 odd minutes. We covered what's the visual storytelling is. We covered what's the approaches or the structure that you need to go through. What's a successful pitch? What are some of the things that stops us from doing that? What are visuals? What are the different ways of using visuals, and how you can have a clear structure and, most importantly, compartmentalize your pitch in a friendly way. And then BrightCarbon resources are there, and the very final point Richard shared about other bits as well. So thank you so much, Richard. Always a pleasure to have you with us in Scribble Talk. I'm sure we'll have you back for one other topic. Until then, stay healthy, stay happy, and I'll speak to you very soon. Thank you, Richard.
Superstar. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
To our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Please visit batchyscribble.com/podcast to listen to this episode and check out any of our other previously recorded episodes. If you've enjoyed today's interview, don't forget to subscribe, review, and share the Scribble Talk podcast. We hope you'll check out our next episode where we interview another industry expert and special guest. Until then, it's Ashley Kays,
Bhaskar Sundram,
signing off.